the author of the bestseller Living to 120, the truths that no one wants to tell you, Adriano Panzironi.
Good evening everyone.
So, Adriano Panzironi, good evening, welcome, is ready to reveal another one of the hidden truths.
Oh yes, tonight we are going to unveil the truths about, let's say, the inability of official medicine to treat one of the most devastating human diseases affecting even more than 5 million people.
Which is diabetes. So let's watch this video and then of course start our episode on diabetes.
Diabetes represents the disease that most reflects the opulence of modern civilization. Virtually unknown until the early 19th century, today it represents a true epidemic and is increasing exponentially, especially in populations with Western lifestyles. In 1980, about 100 million people were diabetic. In 1995, we increased to 135 million. In 2005 to 217 million. In 2010 to 285 million. And as of today, there are 422 million sufferers. With this trend in 2030, there will be about 800 million diabetics in the world. To these completely out of control numbers, we must also add as many people who instead live with hyperglycemia, thus an undiagnosed pre-diabetic phase that is still capable of damaging our bodies, exposing them to diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, and capable of reducing life expectancy by more than 10 years.
So, Mr. Panzironi, the introductory video was very explanatory. Can we safely say without denial that we are facing a real epidemic?
Yes, certainly we are talking about over 400 million sufferers, and consider that 4 million a year of these die from complications of diabetes. But what we are seeing today is nothing compared to what we will see in the near future.
Look, diabetes, in addition to being a health problem, is definitely an economic problem given the very high cost of treatment. Where will we go from here?
Well, we will get to even more dramatic situations, much more than we can imagine. On the other hand, all the statistics or all the statistical predictions that have been made in the last 30 years have always been wrong, because in reality then the data were absolutely more alarming than what had been predicted instead.
Look, we have done so many interviews. I remember in one of our old interviews where you were saying that basically let's say the life expectancy would go down a lot for people with diabetes, and the ISTAT this year just confirmed it. But then is it possible that scientists can't keep this disease under control?
But you see, the statistics of predictions are always made in a linear way. Actually, we don't have to make them exponentially, because today's diabetics are basically our elderly, so our parents and grandparents, who for 70% of their life anyway ate less carbohydrates and moved more. The diabetics of tomorrow, on the other hand, will be our children, who have already started their diet by eating practically only carbohydrates, and the more they do not move. This means that we will get to the onset of diabetes not at the age of 60, 70, as it is today, but under 40. And so if we relate it to the statistics, we are talking about 40% of the population in the future will be a diabetic.
So the situation that you are saying is certainly unbelievable, but also apocalyptic from what you are saying. But in order to give our viewers a good understanding of what diabetes is, we have asked one of our doctors, Dr. Maria Immacolata Costanzo, who in this video explains the differences between the two types of diabetes. Let's look at it for a moment.
Diabetes mellitus is a degenerative disease characterized by excessive blood glucose caused by an absolute or partial deficiency of insulin in the human body. Diabetes is divided into two categories: type Y diabetes, which has an autoimmune pathogenesis, and type 2 diabetes, which has a pathogenesis related to lifestyle, diet.
Che ha una patogenesi collegata allo stile di vita, all'alimentazione.
Also, very often, to how the person walks, moves is very important. Type 1 diabetes occurs at a young age, and type 2 diabetes normally arises with advancing age. type 2 diabetes mellitus accounts for 90% of all cases of diabetes, has a clinical course that almost always begins with insulin resistance of the target tissues, so liver, muscle, adipose tissue. Initially, there is an increase in blood glucose, both fasting and postprandial, despite an increase in insulin production. Finally, in type 2 diabetes patients, there is destruction of beta cells, which also then induces an associated form, eventually of type 1 diabetes.
There you have it, Panzironi. The doctor explained the two differences between type 1 and type 2, so juvenile and senile.
Yes, actually medicine has classified these two types of different diabetes, precisely juvenile because type 1 appears in children because it is an autoimmune disease, and then type 2 instead appeared in elderly people. Actually, this distinction today is much more difficult to make because type 2 diabetes cannot be called senile anymore because today it appears even under the age of 50, so it is definitely an old description.
But is type 1 diabetes more dangerous?
Type 1 diabetes can induce a person's death in 48 hours if they eat the wrong things. For type 2 diabetes, we clearly have more time to also do prevention and then try to solve the disease. Unfortunately, however, we are witnessing an even more dramatic phenomenon, that is, sufferers of type 2 diabetes then see that type 1 diabetes also becomes diagnosed because unfortunately our body tries to compensate for the insulin resistance that precisely is typical of type 2 diabetes by making them produce more insulin. And this leads to the accelerated death of pancreatic beta cells and thus the appearance of type 1 diabetes in people already suffering from type 2 diabetes.
Here, but Panzironi, with all the medicines that we have, is it possible that we can't support people with type 2 diabetes such that they then manage to have type 1 as well?
Medications are certainly a great weapon at the disposal of official medicine, which, by the way, we are not talking about a cure. We simply slow down or rather decrease what is the effect of blood sugar. However, I must tell you that the worst ally of official medicine is precisely those dietary indications that are given to people with diabetes.
Here, about dietary indications, normally physicians do not give dietary indications because that is not in their competence. There are dietitians for that. However, diabetologists have in their protocol precisely nutrition.
That's what I'm referring to. It's precisely the advice that the diabetologist gives to diabetic patients. It's the main reason why patients who could be somehow saved instead see progression from their disease, to then the consequences we know.
Look, so what he's obviously telling you usually doesn't go very lightly with the official medicine. However, we will have maybe the whole episode to be able to explain it better. At this point, I wanted to show a tutorial, as we call it. However, it is a video in which it is explained what are the collateral harms to diabetes, because we are seeing that we are no longer dying from diabetes, but from a whole series of related diseases that come. No, for those who are diabetic. Let's watch this video and then comment together. You're welcome, Director.
Every year, 27,000 Italian citizens die of diabetes, but even more serious is the increased risk of certain diseases in people with diabetes. In fact, 80% of diabetics die from cardiovascular diseases. In addition, 10% of people with diabetes suffer from ischemic heart disease, 32% from neuropathy, 34% from retinopathy that induces blindness, and 30–40% develop kidney failure that can lead to dialysis. In fact, excess sugar induces damage to the arteries and can cause conditions such as diabetic foot and poor repairability of skin lesions. In addition, many scientific studies have found an increased risk of getting cancer of up to 300% more than a person with normal blood sugar. On the other hand, for those who have already been diagnosed with cancer, the increased risk of metastasis is 400% in the first year, and an increased mortality of 500% in the first 5 years.
Panzironi, from this video, then we can understand that the problem in the end is not diabetes, but all the diseases related to it.
Of course, because diabetes is a disease that simply indicates an excess presence of sugar in our blood, in our arteries. So it is this excess that then causes all the degenerative diseases that we know, such as precisely cardiovascular diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, and whatnot.
Look, though, one question that surely hovers here in the studio, but also to our viewers from home who are watching us live, is how come glucose is so harmful to our health?
Of course, this should be known, especially by doctors, because precisely the excess of glucose in the blood leads, as medicine later confirms, to all the pathologies we have mentioned. Well, the problem is that excess glucose comes into contact with the proteins on the surface of our circulatory system, so the arteries and veins, and has a glycation effect. What is glycation? It is a kind of caramelization of these proteins that then induces this tissue to be thicker, induces it to stiffness, and induces the formation of certain formations that are called ages. And these ages are real antennae that start producing free radicals. And this induces systemic inflammation of our whole cardiovascular system. And since every cell in our body, somewhat like all organs, are assisted and are reached precisely to maintain them by oxygen and food, precisely by this huge network that we have of capillaries, this malfunction also induces then a malfunction of the connected organs.
Look, the video also said about an increased risk of cancer.
Oh yes, medicine now fortunately has confirmed that sugar is one of the main reasons for the occurrence of cancer, because cancer cells use sugar. So it is clear that you get sicker with more blood sugar, but even if you are sick, there is an increased risk of the occurrence of metastasis.
Here, you were saying that the problem is also high blood glucose, so even hyperglycemia, perhaps not yet diagnosed as diabetes, can be harmful.
Certainly the problem is that we tend to underestimate this aspect. In fact, a person who has hyperglycemia runs the same risks as the diabetic, clearly in a milder form, but in any case, he or she will see degenerative diseases like those we described earlier appear.
So what we have understood, we need to know right away to understand whether we have diabetes or not. So prevention in this case is important. We have this video that explains how to find out whether you have diabetes or not. Let's see it and comment on it.
Nowadays, it is very easy to find out if you have a problem with diabetes or high blood sugar. It is enough to go to a testing laboratory or a simple pharmacy, and with a drop of blood glucose can be determined. The parameters for arriving at a diagnosis of impaired glucose are as follows. If fasting blood glucose remains in the 70-100 milligrams per deciliter range, the blood glucose is called normal. Between 100 and 124 milligrams per deciliter, if it is in the pre-diabetic stage, and above 125 milligrams per deciliter, we are in the presence of diabetes. The measurement should also be taken 2 hours after the meal, and if it is detected within 140 milligrams per deciliter, we are in the normal range. On the other hand, if it is in the 140 to 200 range, we are in the pre-diabetic phase. Over 200, we are in diabetes. There is also another test called glycated hemoglobin, which assesses blood glucose over the past 3 months by evaluating the oxidation of red blood cells. The values to refer to are as follows. From value 4 to 5.9%, normal blood glucose. From 6 to 6.5%, this is called pre-diabetes, and above 6.5%, diabetes.
So, the video was very explanatory. With a simple drop of blood, we can tell whether we are diabetic or not.
Yes, you say, well, it is enough to take a drop of blood, but unfortunately in Italy I don't know why people don't go for this simple test. Even more than 30% of diabetics are without knowing they are.
Look, obviously finding out whether you are diabetic or not is certainly very important, but can these types of tests also tell if we are pre-diabetic?
Well, sure, it tells us the blood sugar, and so that allows us to do a prevention and decide maybe to change the diet. The problem, though, is that I know so many people who have problems with high blood sugar or even diabetes. They prefer to take pills or get insulin but not change their diet. So it's as if they are delegating to these portentous medicines the solution to their problems when they themselves should be finding it.
Look, I have a little bit of a feeling, though, that there is no real prevention being done on diabetes, or is there?
You're completely right, but the problem is that medicine passes this notion that you just need to take a pill or get insulin, that everything is fine, and so people continue to eat whatever they want. because by taking the pill anyway, their blood sugar goes back to normal. But the problem is that when we take these pills, we are not curing diabetes, but we are simply lowering blood sugar. So it means that a person who has hyperglycemia within 10 years anyway will become diabetic.
So it is a little bit to think, no, that taking the pill helps us. However, a little bit like putting the dust under the carpet, sooner or later it comes out.
Let's say, as I usually say, it's like being an ostrich and putting your head in the sand. But the blame for this, in my opinion, is only on the medical class who should be doing proper prevention. That is when they have a new patient, they should say, I give you the pill, I give you insulin, but know that this is not only a palliative, but it will still induce in the next 10 years to get diabetes seriously, and then run the risk that all diabetics run. So the problem is precisely to have dialysis, limb amputation, the fact that you risk going blind. In short, these are things that the patient should know very well. This would be a proper prevention.
Look, so we have seen that. Anyway, figuring out whether we are diabetic or not is very simple. So you just go to a laboratory or write directly to the pharmacy and get pricked like that. But instead, we have made with the editorial staff a very nice service to make it clear. If you are pre-diabetic, if you are willing, of course, to this kind of disease, by doing a small and quick calculation that everybody, even at home, can do. Let's see it and then comment on it, because it's really very interesting to be able to do that. Let's look at it.
It is possible to determine with relative accuracy whether we are in hyperglycemia, i.e., prediabetes, by simply using the fingers on our hands and answering 5 simple questions. Based on your age, we count 1 finger if you are 40 to 50 years old, 2 fingers if you are 50 to 60, 3 fingers if you are over 60. Based on your weight, if you're slightly overweight, we count 1 finger. If you are overweight, we count 2 fingers. If you are obese, we count 3 fingers. Based on blood pressure, if it is high, we count 1 finger. Based on physical activity, if you don't do any, we count 1 finger. If you have a family member with diabetes, another finger. If you are a man, another finger. If at the end of the count we have opened 5 fingers or more, we are almost certainly in prediabetes. Let's take an example. Mario is 50 years old, so let's count 2 fingers. He is overweight, let's put 2 fingers. He doesn't exercise, let's put 1 finger. He is a man, 1 finger. Total fingers raised, 6. The response is that Mario is almost certainly in hyperglycemia, that is, in the pre-diabetic phase.
So, Mr. Panzironi, to me it really seems like a very simple test and very easy to do at home as well.
Yes, it's an interesting test because it allows people, as you say, from home, to ask themselves 4 or 5 questions and figure out whether you actually are at risk of hyperglycemia or diabetes. So maybe these people will be convinced the next morning to go to a pharmacy to get this simple drop of blood drawn.
I wanted to tell Mr. Panzironi just that of course we are talking about prevention, and so prevention of diabetes is very important, but especially prevention through nutrition. So I'm going to show you a video of what can be considered the style, the advice from current modern diabetology. Let's see it and then we'll certainly have some to comment on. Let's see the video together. E poi sicuramente ne avremo da commentare. Vediamo il video insieme.
The treatment on the one hand has to try to get these sugars that come in away, and this in a physiological way with regular physical activity. On the other hand, the diet is important because it allows only that amount of sugars or carbohydrates that are needed to come in without going into surplus. Then there is no problem with the intake of the first category, meat, fish and eggs. Dairy derivatives are not there, no problem. There are no problems for vegetables, for legumes. There are problems, so they have to be somehow included in a calculated diet. Starches, sweets, carbohydrates, simple sugars, and fruit that basically contains simple sugars. So the special attention, as well as fractionating in the day of meals, is to make sure that in the meals there is not an excess of starches, of simple sugars. If anything, instead an increase in those substances that slow down the absorption of carbohydrates. So give preference to whole grains over non-whole grains. Still introduce legumes. Make moderate use of fruit, and if possible at meals do not introduce fruit, or at least not large amounts, reserving it in snacks. riservandolo negli spuntini.
So what we have seen is Professor Giacinto Abelemigiano from the Policlinico Gemelli in Rome, who was giving the guidance on the kind of diet that a person with diabetes should follow.
Yes, let's say it's the same old thing. They recommend a diet based on 50% of the calories we introduce in the form of carbohydrates distributed in the famous 5 meals. In short, this diet, I don't even recommend it to a healthy person. Think of the diabetic who has problems digesting sugars.
In fact, he was just saying about the right amount of carbohydrates, possibly whole grain type.
But yes, but then in the end, we are always talking about 250, 300 grams of sugars in people who have difficulty managing a blood sugar that is normally 4 grams for our body every hour.
Look, it is still, in fact, the classic Mediterranean diet, only they recommend eating whole foods so that, let's say, they are higher in fiber and reduce glucose stimulation.
Yes, because official medicine always thinks about solving the symptoms, never the cause of the problems. It is evident that by eating a whole food, we will still have a distribution of sugar, let's say, in more hours. However, in any case, our body will have to produce insulin because it is also distributed in several hours. And when we talk about 250 grams of sugar, it is evident that without insulin, which is what our body produces endogenously, we will not survive.
Certainly, however, modern diabetology is always very careful in avoiding glycemic spikes in type 2 diabetes patients so that they can, shall we say, contain glycemic control.
Yes, that's what I was telling you. Official medicine thinks about reducing the small glycemic, but in this case our body produces insulin as a percentage to the sugar that we introduce with food throughout the day, and we have a ratio of 10 to 1, so it means that we will have a peak, let's say, so glycemic low or low. But if the amount of sugar is the same, it is obvious that our cells will still have to produce that amount of insulin. And this may then even induce the phenomenon of insulin resistance or even accelerated cell death, thus the appearance of pancreatic beta cells and the appearance of type 1 diabetes.
The doctor was also talking about fruit, which according to him and according to obviously the indications, the protocol should be eaten in the mid-morning, mid-afternoon snacks instead. Unlike you who says instead it should be eaten during the main meals, so during lunch or dinner.
Yes, actually I don't agree with this dietary advice for the simple fact that fruit as a food contains very little protein and zero fat. So it means that it is a food that we assimilate very quickly, and the sugars present in a fruit, we talk about that on average a fruit weighs 200 grams, so we are talking about 30 grams of sugars, also wanting to calculate that half of it is fructose, and that does not raise our blood sugar, but those 15 grams in any case will induce a rise in blood sugar, and therefore our body will have to produce insulin in any case to lower blood sugar.
So you say it's better to eat it during the meal, so that then by eating also, of course, some protein, the digestion is much longer, and then let's say the glucose is, let's say, spread throughout the digestion, there's less spike.
Certainly for the simple fact that if we have a lunch of protein and fat, it means at least a digestion that goes from 4 to 5 hours. So those 15 grams of sugars are below the best consumption of our own sugars, which is calculated to be around 5 grams per hour, and therefore does not require the activation of insulin.
So, Mr. Panzironi, let's clarify for a moment. The person with diabetes has to be careful about how many carbohydrates to eat, but especially about the sugar content of these foods, and that's precisely why a glycemic index was created, which keeps track of course, the, let's say, the degree to which a certain food raises blood sugar. In this regard, we have a video that talks to us about the glycemic index, just so that all of our people understand it.
Of the glycemic load. Of the glycemic index, you are right, I am sorry.
Excuse me, this is the lineup, otherwise they would kill us in the director's office. At this point, I would say let's watch the glycemic index video.
The glycemic index is able to assess the rise in insulin after eating a particular food. It actually compares the rise in blood glucose that occurs after ingesting 50 grams of glucose with the rise in blood glucose after ingesting other foods with the same amount of sugar. This index thus allows us to evaluate the foods that are most likely to raise blood glucose, considering their composition more or less conducive to this phenomenon. Foods are divided into 3 ranges: low glycemic index, or 0 to 35, medium glycemic index, or 35 to 50, and high glycemic index, or 55 to 110. So there are foods that have higher amounts of sugar, but they raise blood sugar more slowly. For example, if we take durum wheat pasta such as spaghetti and compare it with boiled potatoes, although spaghetti has 80% sugar, it raises blood sugar less than potatoes, which have only 17% sugar. In fact, the glycemic index of spaghetti is 40 and boiled potatoes 95.
Then we have seen how different types of foods are able to raise blood sugar differently.
Because we might have foods that have a higher amount of sugars, but because these sugars are related to protein and fiber, our body takes longer to assimilate them, and maybe have a food that has more sugars but has a lower glycemic index because precisely they are harder to be assimilated.
But we always have to be very clear and simple. With our viewers, though, that's kind of a promise that we made. So we have a card, by the way, so that people understand exactly how the foods are broken down. Here, we're seeing it in the studio as well. They're definitely seeing it from home right now.
As we can see in the medium-low index part, we have average vegetables and some fruits, while in the higher part of the medium-high index, we find what are the staples of the Mediterranean diet, so pasta, bread, rice, corn.
So we understood one thing, that bread, pasta, rice are not useful for diabetes prevention. I can't see where meat, fish are.
They are not there for the simple fact that these foods do not contain sugars, so they are not on this famous glycemic index, and this should make us understand very well that the foods so extolled by official medicine as being healthy even in the diabetic in reality could not be eaten by normal people, let alone diabetic ones.
So we have seen that the glycemic index allows us to understand and evaluate how important it is, let's say, for blood sugar. But there is another very important thing, though, which is the overall amount of sugars within a product. So that's why it was, and how much it affects, obviously, for raising blood sugar. That's why the glycemic load that we were talking about earlier was created. So at this point, we're going to explain it for our viewers with this video, and then obviously we're going to comment on it.
The glycemic load is undoubtedly the most correct method of evaluating foods, also from the point of view of the amount of sugars present, and therefore allows an overall evaluation of one's meal. 4 ranges have been identified: low glycemic load from 0 to 10, medium glycemic load from 11 to 19, and high glycemic load from 20 to 30, and very high glycemic load from 30 and up. To calculate it, we need to know the glycemic index of the food and then multiply it with the percentage of carbohydrates in the food divided by 100. Let's take an example. Pumpkin has a glycemic index of 75 and a percentage of sugars of 3.5%. So the formula will be 75 times 3.5 divided by 100 equals glycemic load 2.62. So although it has a high glycemic index, it is nonetheless one of the lowest glycemic load foods. The foods that belong to the low glycemic load range are basically vegetables and some fruits. The foods that belong to the higher range are all starchy foods, including whole grains.
Then Panzironi, we have seen how important is, in short, the glycemic load, which is more specific to the content, obviously, of sugars in foods.
Yes, actually, it is more correct, because actually we always have to think about the sugar to insulin ratio. The glycemic load gives us the opportunity to understand within 100 grams of product how many sugars there are, and therefore how much insulin we are actually going to produce to lower our blood sugar after we eat them.
Then again, to make sure that our viewers understand well, we have created another sheet to show as far as the glycemic load and the division into the 4 ranges. Here it is, I see it. Here it is.
Yes, the low glycemic load one, we find a lot of vegetables such as carrots or some fruit such as apple, while we have to find that the legumes that had been included in the low glycemic index, now we find it in a medium glycemic load. And this also example for semolina pasta that could be made to think. In short, to be an interesting element precisely because it was present in the low glycemic index range. Instead, we find it at very high glycemic load. This is because in 100 grams of product, there are 80 grams of sugar, so we will still have a major rise in blood sugar.
From what you're saying, I can understand that practically all the products, most of the products of the foods recommended with the Mediterranean diet are out of the protective bands to prevent diabetes.
But not only are they out of those ranges, we should eat only exclusively of the low glycemic load range and the meat and fish and aged cheese and eggs, because precisely from the glycemic load, we immediately sense that we are eating a flood of sugars if we start using pasta, bread, rice, etc., etc. It is no coincidence that the glycemic load also gives us the opportunity to assess the overall load of sugars that we introduce with a meal, because actually we don't just eat 100 grams of product per meal, but maybe we eat 150 grams of pasta, then we accompany it with 1 or 2 slices of bread, then we eat a fruit anyway, we eat vegetables. In the morning, maybe we have a breakfast with cornflakes, and then in short, during the day, we have a significant overall load.
And then we can, let's say, so actually calculate how much sugar we are introducing into our body. In this regard, we have another sheet, if I'm not mistaken. Here it is, I see it on our wide wall, that explains a little bit about the total glycemic load.
Here we have the, let's say, average meal of an Italian who uses the tira mia and the frogs. And well, we go from the 150 grams of pasta, which has a glycemic load of 96, the bread, which has 33 and 20. The fruit, we arrive at a total load of 149. And if instead we see the meal provided by what was the basic diet of man in the second card, if the director wants to put it here, we talk about the meat, which has a glycemic load of 0, and the pumpkin equal to 20. So the total is 20. So there is a huge difference between the glycemic load of a diet based on, let's say life 120, or what is intended for our DNA, and instead what is predicted for the Mediterranean diet.
But so what they recommend with the diet, let's say, that official medicine recommends we get to 149, here we get to 20.
Yes, we are talking about 7-8 times glycemic load, so an unbelievable amount of sugar is why we get diseases like diabetes.
I wanted to show you this clip because modern diabetology obviously does not agree very much with Mr. Panzironi. We see it, and then together with him, obviously, we comment on it. Let's see the video.
The first mistake that all people with diabetes make is really about nutrition, but dramatic mistakes. The first thing is I completely cut out bread and pasta. Now I don't eat bread or pasta. Sweets, I've never had very few. It's really information that is passed down, that is believed, that may be correct, but instead is absolutely wrong. Actually, those who have diabetes in general simply have a valid reason to eat a healthy diet, a healthy and correct Mediterranean diet, of which there is now really very high evidence that they are able in the long run also to prevent as well as cure, but also to prevent diabetes. Simple Mediterranean diet, lots of vegetables, pasta and bread, the right amount. It depends on the individual person, but the average 80-100 grams per meal between bread and pasta are allowable even in those who have diabetes. More than dieting and trying to follow an eating regimen, simply trying to love yourself more. In the diet we also give jam. It's clear that you can't eat 4 tablespoons of jam, but 2 rusks with a layer of jam on top. Very good, especially if the jam is good.
Mr. Panzironi, I could see you powing during the video, let's say, so you certainly don't agree much with what this Dr. Andrea Giaccari was saying.
Let's say it's business as usual to see such an important professor say that precisely even patients who realize that they don't have to eat sugars makes them go back to eating sugars. Look, it really leaves me speechless.
I can tell you one thing, that I was really very surprised to hear these statements, because it seems really strange to me that they give obviously foods that have sugar to people who can't handle, whose own body, obviously sick with diabetes, can't handle just sugar.
But this will always be the case as long as medicine continues to say that we need 50% of the calories we take in every day in the form of carbohydrates, so they also recommend them to diabetics. While the main problem is that official medicine is training more and more doctors who specialize but then forget about the basic functioning of our body.
Listen, however, exactly what are you referring to?
We have 5 liters of blood, only 4 grams of sugar, so someone has to wonder what it means to introduce 100 grams of sugar into a body that normally has 4. It is obvious that we will have a huge insulin activation, and then we are advised the 2 toasts in the morning or the 100 grams of pasta per meal at dinner, and we are talking about 250 grams of sugar per day. It is normal that then this can lead to a problem of diabetes or even using insulin when unfortunately our beta cells are no longer functioning.
Look, though, I don't want to contradict you, but they keep telling us that our body goes to sugar and therefore it is wrong for diabetics not to eat these foods.
Well, they keep saying that precisely, that we have to introduce 50% sugar, but actually the only cells in our body that use sugar are the neurons in the brain and the cells and red blood cells in the blood. And well, these even have receptors that are not stimulated by insulin.
Here is insulin exactly. Where does it go to act to clear the glucose in our blood?
It goes to act in the muscle fiber cells in the adipocytes. So this it does through the GLUT4, which are protein gates that are precisely stimulated by insulin and allow more access of sugar into the cells. But actually the insulin has to get rid of the excess glucose and it goes to deposit it in these cells. So we don't really need this sugar. Simply insulin saves our lives every time we eat a plate of pasta, and it does that by throwing the sugar into our cells.
Look, you mentioned GLUT, so we always have to be very specific and understandable. Let's look at this tutorial, this video on GLUTs, and then of course comment together and see it together.
GLUTs are a family of membrane proteins that allow glucose to enter cells. They are real gates that regulate the access of glucose into different cells. There are 5 different types of GLUT. GLUT1 has a low affinity for glucose and is found in the cells found in the tissues of our body and has the function of letting in only the glucose necessary to trigger cellular respiration. GLUT2 has a high affinity for glucose and is found in hepatocytes, the cells of the liver, and so in the case of excess glucose in the blood it increases transport to the liver. GLUT3 has a low affinity for glucose and is found in neurons. It is responsible for transporting basal glucose for our brain. GLUT4 is the only one sensitive to insulin and is found only in muscle fiber cells, including those of the heart and adipocytes, the fat cells. GLUT5 is found in the enterocyte cells of the intestine and have a higher affinity toward fructose.
So we've seen that there are different types of GLUT, which are kind of gates that let glucose into the cell, right?
Yes. When we talk about diabetes, we are talking about the malfunctioning of only the GLUT4. And so we eat a nice plate of pasta, and insulin can no longer stimulate these GLUT4s to get the sugar in. And so we have hyperglycemia that can even lead to death.
But then, is it true that you earlier said insulin is a lifesaver? Every time we eat a plate of pasta, it saves our lives?
Certainly, insulin is a lifesaver and acts precisely on muscle fiber cells, inducing the release of these GLUTs that we usually find a kind of cistern inside the cells, and then these GLUTs end up the cell cytosol and by cell membrane, and then this action then induces the entry of sugar inside the cell. When this phenomenon is no longer affected precisely by insulin, it is called insulin resistance.
So given the importance of this hormone, I think we need an in-depth study. So I would say to the director to send the video that talks about insulin so that we can then better understand everything that we will talk about later. Let's look at it.
Insulin is a hormone produced by the beta cells of the pancreas, and its main purpose is to regulate blood glucose in the bloodstream. Its action is directed toward those cells that have GLUT4, inducing its release into the cell cytosol and thus its adhesion on the cell membrane. The target cells are muscle fiber cells, including those of the heart and adipocytes. Insulin then raises the reserves of sugars called glycogen in our muscles and stimulates adipose cells to take up glucose from the blood and turn it into fat. When our muscles can no longer take up sugar because they are saturated, insulin acts on the HMG enzyme in the liver, promoting the production of LDL cholesterol, thus allowing the liver to assimilate more glucose. Finally, insulin acts on the hormone aldosterone, causing the accumulation of salt that will cause the cells of our body, which are not normally sensitive to insulin, to take up glucose.
Then insulin doesn't, let's say, it doesn't just use the action with GLUT4, but it has different pathways to be able to clear glucose from the blood.
It also acts on the HMG enzyme in the liver, and that's why it produces the famous bad cholesterol, and then it acts on the kidneys by making aldosterone release and retaining salt. Here we have the problem of water retention, because through this phenomenon, it manages to force the cells in our body to use sugar, even though they normally use fat.
But we're going to look at these cells that are insulin sensitive, and so the ones that have precisely GLUT4, and those are the muscle fiber cells. So our muscles go to sugar.
Let's say that our muscles use sugar, however, not all muscles, because anyway, each muscle band is composed of 3 different fibers, which are precisely the red fiber, the intermediate fiber, and the white fiber. Only the white one uses sugar, while the red and the intermediate one uses fat. So when we want to do a fast run and we do an explosive speed movement, we activate the white cell fibers and therefore the sugar.
And on the other hand, when we do a much lighter activity, for example, a walk or household chores,
in that case, we activate the red and intermediate cell fibers, which instead use fat, so we leave our sugar stores where they are.
Look, though, you were saying that muscles can still take in glucose even without insulin activation, of course.
Of course, this is why we are told that people with diabetes should do physical activity, because precisely this release of gluts from these cisterns in the cells that then end up in the cytosol and then adhere to the membranes letting in sugar, this phenomenon is induced both by insulin but also by physical activity, because when our muscle remains in sugar deficiency on its own, without precisely the need for the hormone insulin, it lets in sugar in this way.
But then why do we produce all this insulin?
We produce it simply because we like pasta, we like bread, we like rice. So when we eat these foods, we hyperactivate this hormone, and this induces to push sugar into the muscle cell fibers and adipocytes, which is why men gain weight in the abdomen and women in the buttocks and legs.
So basically, insulin is the storage hormone. We would therefore need to produce much less.
Certainly, we don't need to produce all this insulin, and nature just didn't foresee for us an excessive amount precisely of production. Not coincidentally, then leads this excessive production to the disease of diabetes. So actually, we should use much less of insulin that we produce ourselves.
Look, though, science tells us that blood sugar is kept constant by the action of 2 types of hormones that are opposed to each other, insulin on the one hand and glucagon on the other hand.
Yes, this is another huge mistake that medicine makes precisely. It tells us that our blood sugar stays constant because of this glucagon that raises blood sugar when it's low and insulin that lowers it when it's high. Actually, that's not the case, because we have different hormones that are able to raise blood sugar, and they do it very efficiently, while we only have the hormone to lower it, and it does it really inefficiently because it causes us to drop blood sugar.
Can I ask you to be a little more specific?
Back then, primitive man ate meat, fish, vegetables, and occasionally some fruit. So nature had foreseen for primitive man the need to raise blood sugar, and therefore made available to our body a series of hormones that are just necessary for this. Whenever primitive man was fighting a beast from the Paleolithic era, in fact, cortisol would raise, blood sugar would give more strength and more speed, and then when this event ended, blood sugar would return to normal. So there was a very calm regulation of blood sugar for primitive man that only had to be raised for certain events.
And so what did insulin serve the primitive man?
It could have happened that primitive man ate too much fruit, so it prevented death from diabetic coma for primitive man as well. However, from here we see that it is inefficient precisely because nature did not provide for this utilization at every meal, as we do today by following the Mediterranean diet.
Look, however, you always say that nature is always perfect. Then why did you predict a negative thing, i.e. the glycemic drop by insulin?
Because as I told you, it didn't really envision us using this insulin, so it's obvious that we go from a protein and fat diet to a carbohydrate diet, so nature would never have envisioned this huge amount of sugar, and so its hyperactivation then leads to hypoglycemia, which is the classic postprandial sleep after we've eaten a big plate of pasta.
You are stating that we do not need all the sugar that the normal Mediterranean diet provides. In this regard, we made a video just to understand what all this sugar that we then ingest is for. We see it, and then immediately afterwards, we also comment on it in a very practical way here in the studio. Let's see it.
Our body's energy consumption is estimated to be 700 calories for humans, taking out the protein portion that our metabolism uses for plastic purposes instead. But how do we consume this energy? About 480 calories are used by our brain, which uses about 20% of the total energy produced. Well, we are talking about the consumption of 5 grams of glucose every hour, but neurons are not insulin sensitive. Red blood cells also use glucose in small amounts and do not need insulin to do so. All the cells that make up our tissues use a basal amount of glucose, but they produce energy using fat. Muscle fibrocells are the only ones, along with fat cells, that are affected by insulin, but they can both also use fat as an energy source. So the question that would be logical to ask is, how much sugar do we need? Doesn't the Mediterranean diet, based on foods such as pasta, bread, pizza, rice, legumes and potatoes, provide too much sugar for our bodies?
So here we are. I ask you right away. The video was very explanatory. It basically summarized for us which organs then use the sugar in our body.
Yes, actually, we only need about 150 grams a day of sugars. Half of these we self-produce by a process called gluconeogenesis, which is precisely when our liver produces sugars from proteins, from amino acids that we use for plastic purposes, and from a molecule that is present in fatty acids, precisely glycerol. So actually we will not need only about 80 grams of sugars that we can safely take from the vegetables and the little fruits that we should eat every day.
So, Mr. Panzironi, you as usual want to make all our viewers better understand and comprehend what we are talking about. You had this table prepared with a series of foods, Do you want to explain it to us?
Yes, this table is divided practically in half. Here on the left we have the diet of primitive man, the one that we recommend in the book Living to 120. On the right instead is the classic Mediterranean diet as taught to us by various nutritionists and also by diabetologists. Now we go back to the left and we see that by having breakfast here with the egg and the banana, we only have this amount of sugar that we introduce with our breakfast. Then we will have maybe a breakfast with a steak and a cauliflower, and this is the amount of lunch. And then again we will have maybe fish, again with cauliflower, and we will be a little repetitive, but I mean it was just to make the point. Okay, while on this other side we have the typical day of the Mediterranean diet. So we start in the morning with 100 grams of cornflakes that contain this amount of sugar. After that, surely at 11 o'clock we will be hungry again, because we know very well that by eating 100 grams of cornflakes, then hunger will attack us around 11 o'clock. So maybe we eat some cookies. These cookies have this amount of sugar. Then we will get to lunchtime. Maybe we will eat, let's say, 150 grams of pasta. And this is the sugar present in 150 grams of pasta.
Practically 80%, we know that.
80%. And then let's say we've always done with vegetables, and this is the amount of sugar we find in the vegetables. Then at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, if we don't eat, we feel sick, so we'll have maybe a crush. And this is the sugar present in a crush, about 80% of its weight. And then
I don't want to stop for a minute, though I also eat a fruit for lunch.
If you also eat a fruit, we have to add that amount as well. Okay, then we arrive at dinner time hungry again, because precisely with the glycemic drop induced by the type of diet, including the crush eaten a few hours before, we maybe have a nice risotto. And so this is the sugar that we find in the risotto. We always talk about 80% sugar. Maybe we always eat this blessed cauliflower or beans, and in fact we have a nice rice with beans, and
we eat us some bread.
We also eat a little bit of bread, because clearly the Italian likes to scarpetta. In short, there are people who even eat pasta with bread, so I think it's quite normal. And then the classic fruit, because precisely they tell us that we have to eat at least 3 times a day of fruit. Well, we introduced this amount of sugars, which is more than 500 grams of sugar in a typical day of Mediterranean cuisine. And this is the sugar that we introduced instead in a primitive or recommended diet from my book, Living to 120. Well, considering that we consume about 5 grams per hour, we absolutely will not raise our blood sugar. Now we are going to look at something even more interesting, because clearly there is a ratio, as we were saying before, of 1 to 10. So if we introduce 500 grams of sugar removed, the famous 60 grams of sugar used that we have in the 12 hours, well, we get to produce this insulin.
Which may seem little, however, I think produced by the...
If we think that we have very few beta cells, and these have to produce this amount of insulin every day, while in the other case we would have no insulin production at all. And so I would say that it is almost strange that we don't become diabetic after very few years that we start doing this diet that is so wrong and so shifted to carbohydrates.
First of all, I see bashful faces here in our studio audience. However, we asked the question at the beginning, and it is also written on our monitor. Can you get well from diabetes?
Well, there are people who, after they have, let's say, changed their diets, even reintroducing simple sugars, their blood sugar anyway has settled back down. But in any case, the question is more, right, but if we don't eat these foods, do we have the need to produce this insulin? In fact, we may even be considered sick by official medicine, but if we don't need it to produce this insulin, the fact that we are, let's say, not in the ability to do so because we have precisely also a type 1 diabetes would not change anything, because we could easily eat our meal with meat and vegetables and not have the need for insulin, nor even that which is made endogenously. So in theory, we are cured, even though for official medicine this is not possible.
And I can only thank Adriano Panzironi, the author of the bestseller Living to 120, The Truths No One Wants to Tell You.